recording this on Chol Hamoed, Sukkot, which is an interesting time of the Jewish calendar. If you think about it, the only time that we have Chol Hamoed outside of Sukkot is, of course, on Pesach. But there's a big difference between the Chol Hamoed of Pesach and the Chol Hamoed of Sukkot. On Pesach, the Jewish people were still making their way through the desert on their way towards what would become the experience at Yam Suf. And it was only after the Egyptians drowned at Yam Suf that the exodus was complete and the Jewish people were fully free. So they were freed, so to speak, on the first day of Pesach, but they didn't fully feel that freedom until their tormentors, the Egyptians, had drowned on the seventh day of Pesach. So Pesach is therefore, Passover is a 7-day holiday. And 7 weeks later we celebrate Shavuos, which is when the Jewish people received the Torah at Sinai. Sukkot, on the other hand, has a totally different relationship, if you will, to the calendar. It is not married to a particular date or set of dates. It's actually based on a totality of an experience really beginning in Nisan, when the Jewish people first were living in the desert, first protected by God, first given the mun or whatever food they needed. Actually, they had food originally with them, but eventually they would get that food, and that continued ultimately for 40 years. So Sukkot is not married to any historical moment. It is not commemorating a particular date or set of dates. And it's interesting in and of itself why Sukkot takes place in Tishrei. We have talked previously about the connection between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, so I'm not going to get into that right now. But either way, the 7 days of Sukkot are curious, and the Chol Hamoed period of Sukkot in particular is curious. And we know that it bridges between the holiday of Sukkot, at least the main, let's call it, sanctity of the first day, in which we are supposed to commemorate the holiday in the fullest sense of the term, with prayer, with taking the lulav and esrog, which is the only biblically mandated day in which we do so, and then bridges it to the back end, which is the Shemini Atzeres holiday. And what is that in and of itself? It's also a holiday that's a little bit hard to wrap our heads around. Shavuos was a day of receiving the Torah, but what is Shemini Atzeres? So Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, in his masterpiece Horeb or Chorev, writes the following. Typically we think that there were three festivals or festive holidays: Passover, Pesach, Shavuos, and then Sukkot. In reality, he says, or Hirsch writes, that there are four: Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, and Shemini Atzeres. And Shemini Atzeres is different than the other holidays, different than Sukkot, I should say, even though they are bridged together. We celebrate it all as one extended period. And allow me to explain how that works. So all the numbers that I'm going to use are based on the Torah, based on how it's celebrated, in Israel, as opposed to in the diaspora. So we have 7 days of Pesach to commemorate the 7 days of the Exodus, as I described before. But that was, Rav Hirsch says, the physical birth of the Jewish people. But we still needed the spirituality. The whole purpose of leaving Egypt was to get the Torah. And that took place 7 weeks later. And we needed a 7-week period to build ourselves up spiritually from a group of slaves to a group of spiritually inclined individuals who are ready to receive the Torah. So we have 7 days, a 7-week gap, and then the 1 day of Shavuos where there is no mitzvah, and we commemorate it purely by spending the night and the days learning Hashem's Torah. Sukkot follows a similar structure. It's also a 7-day holiday, followed by another day. The only difference is that there is no gap this time between the two. So we have 7 days where we focus intently on our relationship with Hashem and how He has allowed us to survive. Rav Hirsch writes that the physical survival of the Jewish people is what we commemorate on Sukkot. So we've got the physical birth on Pesach, we have the spiritual birth on Shavuos, the physical survival is on Sukkot, and we remember not only that moment in Jewish history, 40 years in the desert, which is unbelievable if you think about it in and of itself, how all of the people's needs, millions of people, all of their needs were met, but we also have survived millennia through exile and torment and torture and relocation and you name it. We have experienced it all, and yet we are still here. All of our tormentors are gone, but we are still here. So Sukkot, as we sit in the sukkah throughout this period of time, from the holiest beginning of Sukkot throughout the intermediate period that we are experiencing right now, the intent is to bridge us from this idea to deepen and then bridge this idea of physical survival that Hashem has allowed us to live and to be strong and to be healthy wherever we are. But ultimately the goal is to reach the Atzeres, which is Shemini Atzeres. Just like Shavuos is the Atzeres of Pesach, Shemini Atzeres is the Atzeres of Sukkot. And that's also a time where we think about spirituality, just like Shavuos was the spiritual birth. Shemini Atzeres is the spiritual survival. And we've only survived spiritually, not because of our culture, not because of our language, not because of our clothing. We've survived because of our connection to Hashem as manifested by learning and keeping His Torah. And that is really what Shemini Atzeres is about. And this whole period is to get us to the point where when we arrive at Shemini Atzeres, also known in the diaspora as Simchas Torah, to enjoy it. Actually, in Israel, it's known as the same. There are 2 different days in the diaspora, but to enjoy it in the fullest sense because we're able to appreciate our relationship with Hashem at a totally different level. And that connection ultimately allows us to dance with joy and fulfillment, knowing that we have a very special bond and a very special opportunity. So again, it goes from physical birth to spiritual birth, physical survival to spiritual survival. So this is the holiday of survival. This is the holiday of the eternity of the Jewish people, to recognize that we are a unique nation, that we've survived a lot, we're still here today, we're stronger than ever, and hopefully if we can build on what really makes us tick and recognize the true connection we have with our Torah, with Hashem, and with our nation as a whole, we will celebrate this holiday to the fullest degree, one in which everybody, an enjoyable rest of Yom Tov, Chag Sameach.